we can not.
No. Three things in this stage. First, on my list is a better and more efficient model of housing. Secondly, on the social benefits of communal living, and finally on just like why this is a good place to live. First though, a point of setup, and I guess what we think this would look like. Note that we don't think it looks like making like a huge number of different housing and like changing and like I guess renovating existing housing. We think it's probably just like when new housing is being developed, it is this type of housing that we think would be developed. But also we think it's just likely that like flatmates are already, we think that is a communal living space, so we think that concept of flatmates and living with other people is just popularized and people do that more. We think that's probably what this motion means. Firstly then, or why this is a more efficient, I guess, model of housing, I think just like the way to note at the beginning of this argument and why you should rate this argument highly is that obviously where people live is important. You should, I think, care about this argument. It impacts the experience of their living, also it impacts the way that they can access housing, which is also an important aspect of this debate. Why is this a more, I guess, firstly, this is a more cost-efficient way of living? That's because we think you're able to share the cost for things that tend to be quite expensive. You're sharing the cost of things like amenities, you're sharing the cost of things like food, the maintenance of your house, you're sharing the cost of things like heating, which is typically something that's very expensive. And so that means that like you just, I guess, it is more cost efficient. You probably have to pay less, you have to pay less for these things, and that's very good. But also we think that it just becomes more efficient over time. It's like an economy of scale that develops, and that's good. It's more efficient as well. The second reason that housing is better, it's just that it is like the amount of housing, which is to say that housing is now just more efficiently used. Obviously, like there are the number of houses that are built. Now you just have more people living in those houses. I think that's a more efficient use of space. That's pretty important. That's very important. That means that the number of houses that are being used are just used in ways that are more efficient. That's important. There is less duplication of housing, like people just live in the spaces that exist. More people can live in those spaces. People have more access to housing as a result of that. Second argument then is on the social benefits of living like this. There are a few parts to this argument. Firstly, I guess just like generally, you're living with your friends or you live with people who then you develop and become friends with those people. You develop connections between people. You see them every day, like you're close with them. It's probably nice to live with people who you like. That's a pretty nice experience. I think the impact of this is just firstly, it's good. It's nice to live with people that you like. It's nice to have company. It's nice to have somebody to talk to about what you're going through. But secondly, it's also good because like you just get to share responsibilities with people. Maybe it's like, oh, you can like go and buy the groceries this time. That's probably nice to be able to share responsibilities in that way. But I guess also like perhaps you are like a single mother and a child living in communal housing. Now you are able to share responsibilities for your child. Maybe your housemate can babysit your child when you go out to do something. That's probably a really big benefit as well. Sharing responsibilities is something that is important and is an important impact of social benefits. But the second part of this social benefits argument is to say that when you live in communal housing, it becomes easier to address and recognize social issues, which is to say that when you are living in close proximity with other people, there is more understanding of those people, there is more understanding of difference in opinion, of difference in types of people, which means that we think that there is just probably less polarization when you engage with people more often day to day. That it looks like you engaging in like normal conversations and just like engaging in close proximity and in like the ways that you live with other people just generally does mean you typically develop understanding of other people. And so that is obviously a benefit in itself when you're able to understand other people. We think it also means that like when discrimination occurs, or when discrimination occurs, it is easier to be addressed because you directly are witnessing somebody, I guess, being awful to somebody else. You're able to directly see that, and you're able to more, I guess, understand more the impact that discrimination has and recognize how discrimination actually takes place. So the addressing of social issues, I guess, argument then operates in two ways. You just understand people generally more, but then in a large scale way, you probably understand, I guess, discrimination and things that maybe you don't understand or need to see in proximity to understand. I'll take closing.
Who are the set of people who in the status quo live by themselves, who you envision in your world but now live in a shared home?
I think probably a lot of young people, I guess, rent, and now they will probably live in communal housing, which I think is particularly activates our impact of like connections. I think, I don't know, when people maybe are lonely, and this is good, like people who I guess tend to live alone now benefit more from this connection argument they're making now. I think also like the example I gave before, like often potentially like a single parent and child will live alone, and now they live in communal housing, and they're more able to, I guess, share responsibilities in ways that are beneficial. I think the types of people who live alone, I think, are benefiting most from this case. They benefit most from the cost efficiency and housing efficiency argument I give first, but they also benefit a lot from the social benefits argument that I've just described. Final argument then is just on why this is a good place to live, which I think is perhaps going to preempt stuff that we hear from opposition about why this would be a harmful place to live. Firstly, we just suggest that when this idea of communal living becomes popularized, other norms likely develop to make this a good place to live. So we think it's just like norms do develop to make sure you are sharing responsibilities. Norms do develop to like make sure that you like, I don't know, like when it's your turn to take the rubbish out, like there is a strong, I guess, incentive for you to do stuff like that. But I think the second reason it's a good place to live is that we just do think that people like care about like treating the people that they live with respect. Like we don't think that there would be likely be issues of like, oh, you're not like doing your part to clean the house, because we think people do like care about their living space being clean, for example. They care about keeping their living space well. They care about, I guess, treating the people they live with respect. But also, I guess if people were not doing this and were being, I guess, a bit of a dick in their communal housing setting, we think that's pretty easy to target and call out. Like if someone who doesn't take the rubbish out, it's pretty easy to say, oh, you didn't take the rubbish out, you should do that next time, which just suggests that that combined with norms that develop mean that people likely behave in respectful ways in this housing, and that means that it's a good place to live. But the final reason that we think this is a good place to live is that we think there's just like there's just more collectivization in that you were just able to do more stuff together. You're able to share more responsibilities when you live. You share those responsibilities. That takes a lot of, I guess, personal, takes a lot of the stuff off your personal responsibilities and obligations, but also just generally does mean you probably feel more supported. You have someone to go home to talk about your day. You have somebody, if you've been really busy at work, to say, can you pick up the groceries? This is a good place to live. You're with other people. At the end of this speech, firstly, you should weigh highly the fact that we should probably get more people access to housing. It's a more cost-efficient way to live. More people can access housing now because it's more space-efficient as well. Secondly, there are social benefits, and those social benefits particularly apply to the sets of people who ordinarily wouldn't, I guess, opt in to live in communal housing. Finally, though, we think that it's just is a good place to live, and if opposition make arguments about that, I think the last argument addresses that quite easily.
Thank you, PM.
The problem with a lot of OG's case is most of what they describe is just typically people living in roommates and people having roommates, which obviously is not what this debate is about. What this debate is about is different dorms having communal spaces and obviously being at a larger scale here. And I think there are three reasons why this is distinct from roommates. Let's just say people, when they have roommates, have a large degree of control on as to who they choose. Secondly, there's people that people have pre-established relationships and are more comfortable with. And thirdly, generally occurs on a smaller scale here. And I want to note that for the majority of people, it's very unlikely they have a degree of control as to who they roommate with. Because I'd make the observation that the average person is just quite lonely. The average person isn't a university student with many friends, many social societies. The average person generally isn't a 9-to-5 job, not necessarily the most socially connected person. People generally don't have a large degree of control because they also need someone like in the same income bracket, the same like rental area, the same area they want to live. Unclear they can control it there. That being said, three further arguments. Firstly, on why this makes people less happy. Secondly, why this makes people less safe. Thirdly, why this messes up the rental market. Firstly, why this makes people less happy here. The first thing to establish here is people have a revealed preference for living on their own. Let's say trends in the rental market have it so when people are building houses, they aren't building these areas with dorms and communal spaces. They're building houses that are meant for individuals or roommates as a whole. And that points to a revealed preference that people do have. And secondly, the reason why this can't be a lack of awareness of the benefits that government says, because I would argue that the majority of people do have experiences in living in communal areas. Many people go to college, many people have roommates, many people have gone on school camps and things like that. They do acknowledge how it is living with different people. They have a strong awareness on this. And that is to say, on net, people don't do this. On net, it makes people unhappy. That is something you will value.
It takes a village to raise a child.
It takes a village to raise a child. I think the child problem gets flipped on you because the problem is the majority of people don't want to have children in a communal area because A, they don't feel safe about the people around them, and then B, it's a huge imposition on all your roommates. Let's say your roommates and the people you live with don't want to have a screaming baby all the time, unless you have a child there. That's another benefit for opening opposition is people are less likely to have families. In cases of declining populations, that's probably a bad thing there. Second thing here is why this denies people privacy. Let's say privacy is something that people obviously value a lot, but the reason that people don't have control over many parts of their life. Let's say people don't have control over their work, what their boss says to them, what their parents say to them, but what people do have control is the spheres and places in which they live, and that is something that is particularly valuable to people. That is something that brings you control and stability in your house. It's somewhere that you can go to after a hard night, and somewhere that you are likely to have control. And the problem is if other team tries to respond to this by saying that people still have their own bedrooms and own rooms, obviously this isn't still the same level of privacy. If every time you want to make a sandwich, you have to go disturb your roommates, or every time you want to do laundry, you have to disturb your roommates. Obviously, those aren't things that people have control over. This denies people privacy here. Third part of this argument is why this leads to a large level of interpersonal conflicts, which means that your interactions with people most proximate to you are probably going to be particularly poor, and these relationships will sour over time. But it also explains why people are just unlikely to be happy, and people are unlikely to get the benefits that government says. First reason why this is people just have a wide variety of preferences. Let's say if anyone's moved in with a romantic partner, you notice that sometimes there are different small things that people like different that cause huge fights. Let's say some people are clean freaks, some people are more messy. These are different preferences that people have. Some people want an air fryer, some people want an electric stove. Like, these are things that people care about. These are things that may seem irrational, but people do just have different preferences. These are sticking points that people have. These are things that compound over time, even if it's not always initial. But then secondly, I would argue that this is largely a huge tragedy of the commons. Let's say communal spaces, people do not have an incentive to clean because they think other people do that, and because this means that things just get worse over time. People don't take individual responsibility there. Their claim is that people want the communal place to be clean, but the problem here is even if you want it, it doesn't take on the barrier as to why you as an individual takes that burden to actually do it. Let's say even if you want something to be clean, you can still rightfully assume that maybe other people do it because you're 1 out of 10 people. Why should you have to do that? That means that things in this area just degrade over time. That's particularly bad here. But then secondly, I would argue that people just have different ideas of what are acceptable personal barriers. These happen on religious levels, but it also happens in noise and things like how much noise you make at night. Do you watch soccer games? Do you watch football games late at night? But also just like random stuff, like is it okay to have sex in the living room? Things like this. These are things that are just that people do differ on. We have different ideas of boundaries. These are things that people value differently. These are obviously things that people do not necessarily agree with. These are things that can cause sticking points in relationships. These are things that are particularly bad. And then thirdly, I would argue that when you live in a communal area, you see everyone at their worst. You see everyone they're tired after work and you're stuck with everyone for a long time. This means that you see the worst of people, which means that you do see when people lash out. You do see when people have low energy levels. This means that if they want to claim benefits of your community, I would argue it's worse. When you're most proximate community, you're always with. You see the worst with them. You have all these other things to delineate. You can't go and unwind to them because they also cause a bunch of issues there. Second argument is on safety. Over here, this is just to explain that people are less safe on their side. Let's say, firstly, you may be more exposed, which means that you can get things such as theft. Secondly, things such as interpersonal violence, such as domestic violence, sexual assault, are things that are more likely to happen when you put in with a bunch of strangers that you do not know. Then thirdly, I think just like crazy argument, but people when they misuse appliances can just cause issues. They say deep frying causes fires. When you have one person screw up, you now have a communal area get screwed over. That's bad there. But the final thing is to flip their scope on discrimination here. Their claim is that people understand people of different backgrounds better, but the logic behind this is just insane, is that you insert them in an extremely proximate area with someone someone who's different from them, so you just have a severe harm on that one person there. But secondly, I just explained that you're more likely to experience discrimination when you put into an area with people you don't know. But thirdly, I'd say you have a limited capacity to opt out. And then fourthly, I'd explain that in these scenarios, people are unlikely to call out unacceptable behavior because you have to live with that person for the rest of the time. You're scared of consequence, you're scared of making something that you want to build a relationship for your worst here. Final thing is on the housing market here. First thing to explain here is this results in people having corporate landlords for the reason that individuals are less likely to rent out properties, but that people just don't have communal houses to rent out. And secondly, communal houses per unit are more expensive, which means that it's bigger companies that own them and rent them out to people here. The reason why this is bad is firstly, they have better pricing power. They say they understand what the exact market ceiling is and what the most you can squeeze out of someone is. Unlike the average homeowner who just rents out a house, who generally goes to spend less to make sure that they have a good relationship with the tenant and the tenant doesn't move out there, which means that people are more likely to price gouge there. Secondly, I think bigger and more commercial like rental agencies just do have better legal teams and better ways to evict people. They are used to evicting people, they're fine to have churn rates, they have the ability to attract new people, which means that people are disposable here. Thirdly, I'd say there's a less personal relationship with them. Fourthly, I'd say that regulatory buy-in and people having regulatory lobbying power is just bigger with bigger companies here. Final claim here is that this just contributes to things such as stigma on renters. It's now very obvious when you're a renter versus a homeowner, which means that things such as class divide do become very apparent. People such as post-social discrimination do get worse. These are things that are all harms here. At the end of this debate, what you should take out is people don't want this. It doesn't make them happy. It makes them less safe. It makes the market worse. Obviously, it's bad.
For 4 years of my schooling, I went to a boarding school. I was at school for the entirety of the week. And throughout my time at school, I went through sickness, I was sad, I was down, and other things like that. I experienced what everyone else experiences as they go through their teenage life. And the important part about it was when I was at school and when I had those experiences, I couldn't suffer in silence, I couldn't suffer alone. I had to walk past people that were my friends, people that I knew. They could see that something was wrong and they could address it. That's the important thing that we present you on our side. Because the reality of many people's lives and many renters' lives is they do experience things like sadness and depression. They do have times where they're down, but they do so in silence. They're able to lock themselves out from the world and they're able to experience the kind of stigmas that exist more broadly. Whereas on our side, we block those things from happening. We force people, we insert a circuit break into this situation. People now engage with others. People are more aware of the reality of other people's lives. Because what happens right now, what opening opposition tries to describe, is the fact that people are very curated in the ways in which they present themselves to other people. And they frame that as a benefit, but I think it's a harm. Because when you think about other people and you only see them being happy, you only see the good parts of their life, the times when they're willing to show themselves to you, you have a false perception of what your own life should be like, and you feel like you shouldn't tell them about the things that are bad in your life. You feel as if when you are feeling sad, you are the one that is wrong, and you are instead experiencing something that is normal and perfectly human to experience. I think they ought to be more realistic. Even if people, because the reality is, people are probably maybe just as happy on our side, but when they are sad on our side, they don't do things that are actively harmful and enforce that kind of sadness and depression. They don't lock themselves in their room and in their house. When they call sick from work, they just stay at home by themselves, and that is a harm that they have to cop. Now let's talk about more deeply what they say on being less happy. The first thing is to say there's a revealed preference for living alone. I think the problem here is there is a tipping point in terms of whether or not people are willing to accept that they would live in a communal space. But and we overcome that by increasing the prevalence of it. But the second thing is to say this relies on a misunderstanding of how the incentives go in terms of the development of property. That is to say the property developers themselves have an incentive to try and upcharge people and charge more from the people that are renting their homes. You can obviously do that more when you can have claims of having really good bathrooms for each individual person. And our side inherently here is suggesting that people now get charged less because what they are paying for is maybe to some extent a less private experience. Necessarily we think that is something that we are willing to cop. They must rely on each individual renter having enough pressure onto the developers such that their personal preference comes through into that. But the next thing is to say that this is a that many houses are built individually, yes, but that is because they are also given to people who aren't renters. That is, say, people might buy them out at some point, or they might have been made in the beginning so they could be bought, and then they become rental properties later. We are creating a unique set of properties that are specific to renters. The next thing that I say is about interpersonal conflict. The problem here is that firstly, this can just be addressed by the selection of individual people. That is to say, if you have a preference for being particularly tidy, obviously there can be somewhat of a sticking point in it, as in whether or not you get selected to this aspect of communal living. But the second thing is to say, we just preempt this. Because we explained to you, it's not that people want the place to be clean, but it's also they can tell who isn't making it clean. Like, you have direct ability to know who did leave the kitchen untidy, and you have the ability to enforce social repercussions and condemnation upon them. But the reason they explain that you want to be friends with these people and you don't want harmful experiences means that people would preemptively avoid causing that to happen, avoid this kind of condemnation. As well as that, the reason that they explain that people deeply care about this would overcome the unwillingness to engage in that social condemnation they describe. Now when they talk about the worst set of people, about people with low energy and lashing out, again, we flip this, as I said in my introduction, because the important fact is, when people are low energy, that is when it is good for people to understand that is something that they're going through, particularly say if we're talking about things like depression and mental health crises. It's important that people understand and are willing to help you. They are aware of what you are going through, because most of these things, most people suffer in silence when they go through this. That ought not to occur. Now on being less safe. The main problem here is they just act as though the incentive to do these things is the exact same. But I just do think that people are far less willing to commit domestic violence or assault when it is extraordinarily visible, when people are far more proximate to you. This is like the fact that domestic violence is probably more common when you are in an individual, like, white picket fence kind of home, because it's much less easy for other people to identify that it's occurring and step in. They claim that you wouldn't want to step in because you would feel as if you would, like, break that relationship. The problem is people have a long-term incentive to not have abusers in this home, to police these sort of things, so that it just does become a safer environment. But the reason this opening opposition team thinks safety is important is the exact reason why these people would be willing to talk out and oppose it. I'll take a point from closing.
If there's some people who are naturally kind of okay with mess and make the decision that spending heaps of time cleaning is not in their interest, why should those people not be allowed to action their own preferences in their own home without being confronted by their husband?
Firstly, I would just outweigh this with a set of other things. Like, you were talking about your ability to, like, have agency over living in a mess, but we talk about people having access to housing because it becomes lower cost, because we get more housing, because the square footage per home, like, just think about, like, the notation of this in the sense that, like, everywhere has to have a bathroom, every house has to have a bathroom in an apartment when you're on their side, but on our side, you only need a couple of those bathrooms and you get, like, 10 extra homes on that level. I think that is an important delta in this debate, engage with a reasonable trade-off here. The next thing, though, is just to say that I think obviously those people can select to be with each other in a way that that means that they can still live in those kinds of factions. I think that's reasonable. Now then, let's talk about corporate landlords. Firstly, be comparative. Corporate landlords exist currently. Things like apartment blocks are often owned corporately. It's unclear why that isn't, that's likely to be the majority currently. Secondly, is this bad? Like, they never meaningfully explain why this is likely to be true. As well as that, I just do think when they talk about less people individually renting out homes, but it's like the individual person that tries to buy a bunch of homes that owns like 3 different houses that does end up driving up the price of rentals. But furthermore, weigh this against what we tell you about the fact that you are unable to charge more. They claim like just ambiguously that it's more expensive per unit. No mechanization. We provide you mechanization in the sense that you have things like less privacy, which means you're less able to charge more money. There is a comparative to houses where you are individual, which suggests this is a lower version, which then means that it costs less. Furthermore, there's just more of it. You're able to build more of it at a lower cost, which just means to get the same kind of profit margin, you do not have to charge as much, which suggests there is just less money on our side. On who would use the share house. As we explained to you before, this looks like people who might be lonely, who might want to engage with those people. It looks like people who just want a home. Because we explained we increase the number of homes that exist, I think that is important. Yes, you might have like restricted, so these might be low SES people buying these homes, but the comparative to those people is not having a home. Because we increase the number of homes that exist, and we decrease the cost to access those homes. That is an important thing that you will weigh heavily in this debate. At the end of this speech, we explained to you more people have access to homes, the people in those homes live far more fulfilling and joyous lives, and generally we reduce things like racism and sexism. Those reasons, proud to go.
I want to start this speech with 3 observations about the opening government case. First one is that in the status quo, you can already have roommates if you want. You could already live in share house, which means that people are particularly concerned about cost, as they suggest some people might be, or people who particularly enjoy the idea of living with other people already have more than enough capacity to cater to that need. Considering that, like, you don't need a specific type of housing in order to enact that preference. You can just rent an apartment or a house and share it with the appropriate number of people. So that need is already met. That is not a benefit this team can claim. That is entirely symmetric. Secondly, we note that people overwhelmingly don't want that form of living, which is why, for example, the only people who tend to live in share houses are poor students who, as soon as they have the money, move out to studio apartments. Secondly, that people overwhelmingly opt for larger houses, which is why the size of housing, for example, has doubled since 1950. People want more space and more privacy, and it's why occupancy per house has fallen. People don't want to share, people want privacy, and they want the space to do so, which means that this team would need to demonstrate some reason why it is that people, if this is so good for them, are not just choosing to opt into it, and we preemptively explain exactly why that is unlikely to be the case. But finally, and really the death knell for this team, is that this isn't a debate about whether you should have roommates or not, it's a debate about a specific kind of housing. If you read the info slide, it's very clear that what they're referring to is dorms. You have your individual apartment, where you have a bed, where you have a desk, where you have a sink. For everything else, for your bathrooms, for your living area, for your kitchen, that's when you go into a communal area, which is quite distinct from what this team describes for a number of reasons. Firstly, because you're sharing with many more people than you would primarily, so the number of interactions increases, and with it, so do the number of conflict points. But secondly, because it means you have far less control about your environment. It's not you pick your two closest friends and move into a share house, it's you move into a dorm with like 9 other people who you might not know and you very well might not get along with, which is precisely why all of the harms we identify are likely to be so bad. Closing.
Why do college dorms hire security and cleaning staff?
Yeah, so I will deal with that later. In short, one, if you believe that that is what will occur, that drives up the cost and removes your opening government's benefit, which is like, it's really cheap because you share everything. If you have to have professional staff in order to pay for everything, it's more expensive, which is why, for example, college dorms are notably not particularly cheap, and often most people choose not to access them in countries like Australia where there is an option. And two, we would also point out that, in many instances, those services are insufficient to really counter all of the harms that we identified. Like, you need a lot of cleaning in many instances, and security can't be everywhere at once. So, moving on then, what does opening government tell us? Firstly, they say this is a very efficient form of living. Like, my first question is just, why do we care about the efficiency of living? Like, it would also be very efficient if we forced everyone to move into their neighbor's house, and then we, used half as many houses, but that would suck because everyone would have much less space. Like, we have money for a reason, it's that we can have nicer things. Why would we not want people to be able to, opt into nicer things? But secondly, we would note that also, people clearly have a revealed preference to not want this in the first place. Doesn't make sense. Secondly, they say there's social benefits to living with someone. One, you could just have roommates, which we point to as a likely alternative for people who want that. Two, you could have hobbies, you could have a communal garden, you could have neighborhood association. There's many ways to develop communities, many ways to have friends, and many ways to access this benefit. It's not at all unique. Secondly, you don't choose the people you interact with here, which explains why you're very unlikely to get along with them, very unlikely to want to spend time with them, and this is a very poor way to gain that particular benefit. Finally, we would note that their claim here that it reduces conflict and addresses social issues is just insane. Like, this might be the worst version of a contact theory argument, which is if you throw 10 people together, like, they'll solve racism. Like, that's obviously not how it works. You're far more likely, for example, to be a victim of discrimination because you get paired with someone who has big problems with you. You're very unlikely to want to generate large amounts of conflict because you fear it'll turn into, interpersonal violence against you or it'll escalate tensions. You're far more likely, for example, to just try and avoid the person rather than some form of, forming a neighborhood watch and, ganging up on the person who's a secret racist, whatever. I don't understand how this is meant to work. It seems very unlikely. Then they say, well, we could develop norms which would make it easier to live with each other, but we explain that this is broadly insufficient because the tragedy of the commons is far more powerful because people have very distinct preferences, and no matter what norms you decide upon, some people feel put upon. You make the slob feel bad because they don't want to clean because they're quite happy with the mess, or you make the neat freak, lose their mind because everything's covered in dirt and they don't understand why they have to live like this. Why is there mold growing in the closet? It just doesn't make sense. Where did it come from? What's going on? All of this is exactly the kind of thing that's likely to generate huge numbers of problems. Finally, they say, well, it's good so that people can't isolate themselves because, otherwise you'll notice when something is wrong with someone. But, that's why people are friends. Friends will check in with each other. Your neighbors could check in with each other. You could have roommates if that's a particular worry. None of this is exclusive to the particular kind of housing that this team has to defend. Finally, they say, well, maybe it's easier to identify things like domestic violence when there's lots of people watching. One, there are also lots of people watching if you lived in, say, an apartment. 2, it's unclear people would know about things that occur within your own little apartment within this kind of housing. And 3, we know a large variety of forms of violence that could accrue to you, not just specifically like intimate partner violence. For example, just the risk that like someone's drunk when you're in the kitchen and they get a bit violent when they happen to be drunk. The fact that people would steal your shit, which might be left in communal areas. It's far more than just this one very limited form of violence. Yeah, sure, opening government.
Our benefits scale with the size of the communities, and by having more of them, it can override an existing capitalistic norm towards individual life and different houses like the American dream.
Cool. Firstly, I don't think people are pressured into suboptimal housing by a norm for the reason that we preemptively explain at Jehiel, which is people are already exposed to a variety of forms of communal living, and if it was superior, they would continue to opt into it. The fact that people who have roommates tend to leave as soon as they can afford to do so tends to suggest that our claim is true, and in fact people don't particularly enjoy it and would prefer, for example, not to do so. And secondly, I think the fact that there's more people is precisely why this is likely to fail. There's a difference between curating a set of friends you get along with well, and you can pre-screen for things like preferences for how the home should be run, versus being put together with 10 people with a very random set of preferences who are very unlikely to get along. Which is why, for example, there are so many horror stories about like rooming at majors when you get paired with a random person and it ends particularly badly. Think about the one with Julian Ingham for some good examples there. So, how do you weigh our extension then against what other teams have brought? Firstly, I think we explain why this is bad for the housing market writ large, and the important claim here is not like corporate landlords are evil, it's that they have more information when it comes to pricing, so they're more able to hit the top of the market because they know what the market will bear, versus individual landlords. It's that they're better at doing things like evictions, it's that they can more easily afford things like churn, and it's things like it's much easier to stigmatize against people because you know where they live now. There's a huge divide between you own your house and you live on your own, and you're like a rentier who has to live in a little pig pen, so now it's far easier to discriminate against those kinds of people. People are far less safe, which is a huge impact because it means people are more likely to be stolen from, they're more likely to experience violence, and they're just less happy. They're forced into a form of accommodation they don't want, that doesn't meet their preferences, that doesn't grant them privacy, that denies them control.
Thank you, Jehiel.
The problem with our opening government team, they do a pretty okay job at characterizing what it's going to look like. We think we need to do better, and by doing better, we can just knock out all the harms that brings up in this debate. So 2 things in this speech. Firstly, intensity, secondly, flexibilization. So first, in intensity, I'm just going to go through and actually step through why this is likely to work, to happen in a good way, and what this is actually going to look like. So firstly, where does this happen? OG says we get more housing, unclear what this actually happens. The novel contribution we tell you here is actually people want to live near the city because they have better access to amenities, they have better access to infrastructure, better access to jobs, right? Because jobs are in the city, a lot of people near the city, there's a lot more shops, you have a larger market, etc., which is why you're likely to get more amenities, more shops in the city, etc., etc. So people want to live near the city, which is why we see a lot of development currently going on near places like Green Square or in the West, things like that, right? So I think supply and demand just answer this question for us, because if people want to live near the city and have a greater capacity to allow them to do so, there's going to be more housing of this particular kind in the city. So lots of new development will happen in and around the CBD in this model. So what does this actually look like? The economies of scale argument doesn't just apply to how a single house is going to work, how a single house is going to be built. It also applies to how groups of homes are constructed. So it's not just likely to be one big share house, but that's one single story home. It's likely to happen in a large apartments building type of situation, but it's going to be in the model described to you by OG. Note that they don't actually tell you how this is likely to look like. We do the novel contribution of what is actually going to, we prove the scale this is likely to occur. So, because people no longer care about the selling point of privacy, you are just able to access things like higher density housing under this model. So, what is the actual impact of this? So, firstly, just amplifies the scale of every community building mechanization you get from OG. So, we vastly extend the scope of benefits they're able to claim there. But secondly, you also get to access the benefits of high density because you just get more amenities. I described earlier why this happens, because you have more people in a small space, which means there's a higher ability for you to capitalize on new customers, which means that businesses are incentivized to set up to set up shop near these areas, right? Secondly, you just get better infrastructure because the government can justify high capacity rapid transport, which is like you get all the benefits of the new metro system, but that applies everywhere around this like new development area, right? And finally, you get an environmental impact as well because like there's less urban spread because people aren't moving out away from the city. They're sort of in like the same contained area. You get like less land cleared, things like that. All will be good for the environment. Not now. So what is the actual weighing of this? You get better access to jobs in a wider area because you're not able to like you have better access to transport because you are able to access things outside your local area. But also it's particularly good for young people because like you get like definitely in their early career if they're renting, so like they're able to access like better paying jobs in the city, or maybe they can like go clubbing more. I don't know, like value happiness. But also you get a better quality of life because of all the amenities access you have, which are speculative from OG. They touch on this later. We are the ones who actually proved this. Why this is actually going to happen. I'll take a point from opening.
Yeah, we can just build regular apartment blocks near the city, and we can build them basically infinitely high. Why do we need your thing in order to get the benefits of density?
Because like you have high density, but not very high density, if that makes sense, because you fit more people. And because like if every apartment has its own kitchen and living room, obviously using a lot of space. If less apartments have less living rooms, if you're able to like spread this in a more efficient kind of manner between multiple households, you just save space, which means that yes, you might have high density building on your side, but we have the highest possible density of housing on the our side, which is like you have more efficient use of space. So we just fit more people compared to you, even though you kind of maybe are able to do it well, but like we just do it better. So secondly, on collectivization, two things here. Firstly, on tenant and landlord relationships, and secondly, on tenant and tenant relationships. So firstly, on tenant and landlord relationships, which tell you that when there are more people living in your house, you're just forced to act better because like first it's a competition mechanism because you are competing for a large group of renters with other landlords, which means that like you are more incentivized to put more money into things like renovations, or you're more incentivized to put more money into things like appliances to actually attract the highest quality renters, whatever, for your own kind of housing, which means the pool of supply goes up, but also the pool of quality supply goes up. Secondly, even if you are a banned landlord, firstly, banned landlords are just symmetric under both sides of the house, but we actually fixed this issue because like bad landlords is better dealt with on side guard because tenants are able to not collectivize. You know, this is different from like homeowner associations on like side because like you're collectivizing against one single landlord, not collectivizing in a community against multiple landlords. So your comparative power increase of collectivization is just much higher on side CG. What are the actual impacts of this? First, you can lobby landlords to fix things if they refuse to do so. You can threaten to leave or whatever. Like you probably have a high supply under your side of the house, but they don't. They're competing with other landlords for money. So like they're forced to kind of actually address your concerns. Where if you're a single landlord, a single tenant in the status quo, you do not have a large amount of power in this kind of in this dynamic. Secondly, you have a better capacity for pooling resources, which means you can seek legal help if necessary if your landlord refuses to fix things even at this point. And finally, you have more power to fight against rent increases, which responds to OO's claim about like corporate landlords being like shitty and like price gouging everyone. That's like really intrinsically fixed by the fact that we have a better supply or better supply, but even if you don't buy that mechanism, you should buy this. Second kind of impact, actually I might take one more point if anyone has a closing. Okay.
What defines an introvert?
What defines a what?
An introvert?
An introvert? Someone who enjoys living by themselves, or like they have a limited social battery. But like, if your point is that like people are going to be forced to interact, I think this is a very low impact plan because people are forced to interact with other people in society anyways. But also they can just like opt out of this, like just stay in their room if they want to. Like nonsensical POI. Finally, on tenant and tenant relationships. But the comparative friends probably just bad. You have a very small number of people to choose from. So if you have a messy friend, just opt and learn living by yourself. So you get better You get better opt-in under our side because you have a large range of tenants to choose to live with. But also collectivization fixes all of these issues. In the worst instances, you can get cleaning and security, because you have better capacity to pool resources to access things like cleaning and security. There's a less burden or cost on one single tenant or one single person, but also the greater quality of services you can access because you are able to pool your resources together, which is that when you need to access security, you can access better security. Also, just like one more thing on like legal protections. OG tells you about like norms changing. That's probably like not very certain. But what is certain is like the law system adapts to this change. Therefore, you're more likely to get like law necessarily kind of like well defined to deal with these issues. Proud to govern.
Thank you, Governor. November.
There'll be three parts to this speech. Firstly, I'll engage charitably with the characterization of this that we get from opening government, which is that you're by and large rooming with your friends in share houses. Secondly, I'll explain why the other ways that this might occur would be overwhelmingly bad and terrible for inequality. Then finally, I'll explain that this would alter the decisions that people make about their life paths in perverse and unpleasant ways. Firstly, let's engage with opening government. I think opening government probably does have the right to define communal housing. I do think share housing is communal housing, so we're going to engage charitably with it. And to be fair, I think that in a world where the number of people engaging in communal housing increased for whatever reason, it seems a little bit unfair, but I think that people would likely try to get into the dormitories with their friends, I guess. I think though it is just bad to live with your friends for a couple of reasons. Firstly, I think that sets of friends who live together within friend groups creates a weird, perverse kind of influence on that friend group because you get relatively closer to the people who you live with as opposed to the people who you do not live with, which I think can take relationships which are good when people do not live together and make them worse. But secondly, I would say that this means that things like household fights become extremely high stakes. People are scared of conflict, not just because they're conflict averse, but also because they know that it has real consequences for their relationships with their friends, which means that things that might otherwise seem trivial and things that you might otherwise be able to have a productive and rational conversation about become difficult. It has a chilling effect, which is bad, not just for the living arrangement, but also for your friend group. You shouldn't shit where you eat. But thirdly, people go to less effort to hang out together with their friends at the detriment of their long-term relationship. Because you just live with each other, you don't need to do things like have hangouts that are like kind of separate. But the problem with that is, of course, eventually you might want to move out of the share house. And that's bad because you've lost the things that actually tie that relationship together beyond just happening to live together, which means I think that it is just better when people have a strong friend group that exists outside of their home. They seek out when they want to see them, that they're incentivized to catch up with regularly and invest in. I think that's really important. I finally want to rebut the thing which is like, well, people will be nice to their friends and have useful conversations with them. I just want to note that I think in particular, a lot of conversations about the way that household chores, etc. get done are likely to be like, in addition to being irrational, likely to occur, for instance, along gendered lines. I think it's pretty common that people don't realize the kinds of demands they're making of each other, but that they are unfair. The final thing I want to note about opening government's characterization of it being about share houses is that we can flip the claim they try to make about housing supply, which is like there's a unique set of properties which are rental properties that you're not competing with buyers for. I think clearly share houses, you are most likely to be competing with buyers who are richer than you, that drives up property prices. Like share houses are houses which can be used by families, people with probably professional jobs and more money, which means that it is most likely that the prices of things like share houses are inflated relative to things like studio apartments, where the sets of people you're competing against for studio apartments are other young people, other early career professionals, other people who don't want to live with anyone else, and therefore are much more likely to be like in your tax bracket, I suppose. So if you believe that like having a unique set of rental properties is a benefit, it is very unclear to me that share houses would allow opening government to claim that benefit. Alright, that's charitability out of the way. The next thing I want to do is just explain why this would be done in bad ways, because given that people don't seem to organically have this preference, you have to ask how you would go about changing people's preference. Now, I think the place where overwhelmingly this is likely to occur is just the place where the government has the most power over people's decision making with respect to housing, which is to say things like affordable housing and things like and things like social housing. And I think that this is particularly bad for two reasons. Firstly, I think it is just really unjust for people with the least capacity to control their decisions over where they live, to have like their privacy taken away, to have to I guess live in a way that is different to everyone else and everyone's seemingly organic preference, merely because they're most at the whims of the property market and they can't find, they can't buy into a private home. But secondly, I would note that I think that this substantially increases the problem with some of the risks that opening opposition talks about. Like, yes, it is true that privacy is good, or yes, it is true that there's a risk of violence, sure, but I think that exists most in the situation where people who are relatively disadvantaged, who might be experiencing things like social problems, like unemployment, who might struggle to buy into housing, which it might be more dignified. I think putting those people together with minimal privacy, with minimal capacity to protect themselves is really bad. That's why I think it's really important, for instance, that things like housing commission developments, like actually commit to ensuring people have their own dwellings, ensuring people don't have to share a kitchen with their neighbour in case things go wrong, because these people are vulnerable, because they do not have the capacity to move and to respond to that, because they have limited recourse when things do go wrong. I think that's the highest impact material, and I know that it impacts a set of people who are extraordinarily vulnerable, which is why the government can force them into these shitty fucking dorms in any instance. I'll take closing now.
We explained why you would like to get housing in the CBD. In the status quo, a lot of public housing happens in like areas with a lot of like drug-related crime in like cities off or southwest. It's not a practical alternative to what happens in the status quo.
What? No, because, so number one, your explanation that this happens in the CBD makes no sense, because you're like, it's a matter of supply and demand, but that would explain that also on our side, supply, like the demand is the same, right? So you just build more single, like you just build normal apartments in the CBD, so I don't understand this. But secondly, I've just described that the place where the people who are most likely to be forced into your dormitories are people who are not agentic in the property market, they're not expressing their supply and demand, which explains that like the government can just decide where you live because you don't have a choice, because you don't have any money. So it would just, there would still be in Southwest Sydney, and also it's, you know, it's not like a curse on Southwest Sydney that makes there be drugs there. Like clearly there's social factors that create that, and I've just explained that those social factors are worse when you don't give people privacy, you force them all in together. No, I'm not going to take opening, I'm so sorry. All right, this means people finally make bad decisions about their lives. I think as I've characterized, people just probably don't want to live in these situations. I think opening opposition to their credit explains this pretty well as well. And I think what that means is people make two really shit decisions. One, they're less willing to move out of their family home, which I think is regrettable because it constrains people's agency and does also constrain people's privacy. Still better than the alternative of the dormitory, but it's kind of miserable. But secondly, I think it means that people try really hard to buy into the property market and get get their own residence too early. And I think that's really bad because it means people have less flexibility. They can do things like move around less because rentals are just more flexible than owning a house. It gives people less agency over their career. It means they make less optimal decisions. But additionally, it means that they're over leveraged in a big way. People get fucking desperate to have a mortgage, and that's incredibly bad. It's hugely constraining. It means that they're far more financially constrained than they would be if they just had to pay rent and had that flexibility. It means that they're far more exposed to the risk of things like financial crises, things like interest rates going up. And it's finally terrible for inequality and property prices because it means that people are so desperate to buy into the property market, they drive the prices of houses to own up. It means that buyers compete with renters. We would prefer a bigger rental market in which people had more flexibility, because rental is something in which we're dignified, which people actually enjoy living in.
The reason renting is abysmal for most people is because of the huge power imbalance that exists between them and their landlord that allows the landlord to increase prices of rents at times where there is no kind of heads up as a result. That allows landlords to not fix mold for months and months on end. That allows landlords to not fix communal heating, to fix plumbing, and to fix the basic necessities you need to make housing livable. A world in which people live alone is a world in which that imbalance is defined. A world in which people live together is one where they all share that same problem, where they can pool their resources and pool their collective bargaining to actually get that change. This means that by having communal housing, we make sure that rental properties are livable, clearly the biggest impact of the debate. Let's first start off with this extension, explain how this fixed the renter power imbalance. We explained two things in mechanization. We first of all explained that landlords currently have the ability to isolate and abuse tenants, because of course they have a huge financial incentive to do so, because they can squeeze every dollar they possibly can out of them, and they have the capacity to do so, because individual tenants lack the ability to have lawyers because they don't have enough money. They might lack the time or confidence to actually do any change about the abysmal state that they're living, because the landlord isn't carrying out repairs that only they can carry out. We second of all explained that by ensuring direct collectivization, by spreading these problems over a large group of
working people, it is first of all more likely that resources exist to make sure landlords actually have to fix this, and second of all, make sure that at least one person in that communal living space has the time, has the energy, or has the motivation to actually ensure that there is a level of change there. How does this mechanization get responded to? Our first is kind of implicit from open opposition, where they have a claim about how it's bad to have corporate landlords because they've got a huge amount of power and that allows them to scam tenants. First of all, it is unclear that the power disparity between tenants and landlords can actually get any worse, because while there might be corporate landlords on our side, the difference in political capital, the difference in money, and the difference of access to law is still incredibly high, so that difference doesn't seem very large. But second of all, we explained that existing landlords on the world opposition bench are also corporate landlords, because the normal structure for housing ownership is that one person buys like 10 houses, and so obviously they've got the same access to the market, they have the same ability to squeeze individual tenants. And third of all, even if that was true, we provide collectivization, which provides a force to fight back against these corporate landlords, which explains that this implicit response from opening opposition doesn't work. What are the impacts of this extension? Our first is that all housing is just constructed better, because when landlords know they could get sued for the poor construction of their housing, they have to, in the first place, actually make sure that housing is good, so it means people don't have to jump through these hoops and actually don't have to be hurt by this. It means, second of all, poor housing is fixed better, and don't let anyone else in the debate run away from this impact. Mold in walls for long periods of time kills people. Exploiting pipes means that you can't have access to running water, and malfunctioning heating means you are cold in the coldest nights of the year. This is a huge impact that we obviously fix with closing government. But third of all, we explained it's way easier to access communal support staff, to do things like security, and to do things like cleaning, to make sure the quality of that housing is better for everyone. Opening opposition says access to that communal support staff is unlikely, because either first of all it is expensive, or second of all it is ineffective. But first of all, it's not expensive because of their own characterization. They explain it's probably a lot of people in all these circumstances, and you're only subsidizing the wages of a few people, which means even if it's like, I don't know, an extra $5 every week or month, it is probably enough to pay for these salaries. But second of all, it's not ineffective, because first of all, even if there are a few security guards, people are afraid of the repercussions of being caught by their security guards, which explains why you don't need that many. And second of all, if there are only a few professional cleaners or cleaning staff, these are professionals, they can kind of destroy this stuff. It's very easy to clean a place if you're really professional at it. The result of this is we land a few very big impacts in the debate. How does this weigh against opening opposition and opening opposition and opening government? The first is to explain from opening opposition. They claim is that the privacy of housing gets worse and that is a harm. But we explain that we actually increase the livability of housing, which is far more important than privacy. The intuition for this is that you could be maximally private by living in the woods somewhere, but you don't do that because you get like the livability of your housing, which means that we actually have a higher order impact than them. But second of all, our impact is far more acute. This is literally life and death, homelessness, or having a roof over your head. Because if a landlord is able to increase the price of your rent unexpectedly, you are just kicked out. The result of this is that the analysis about privacy doesn't seem to make much sense, and the analysis about how there's other staffing stuff means that stuff about safety is also kicked out. The reason these beats opening government is twofold. Their first claim is providing a bunch of mitigation as to why the housing on the their side doesn't suck. And this is maybe a little bit spooky in opening half, maybe you don't know the way this goes. We provide an active harm to the status quo. So even if you believe that this housing is kind of bad, you should believe that the current housing is way worse, which means that we kind of help opening government get over that. But second of all, their claim is that living with friends is really nice. The reason this is less important than our housing analysis is because first of all, it's inexclusive. People can have friends elsewhere. The benefit is like, well, you can't avoid getting seen by the people you live with, but presumably this is the same for the people you work with, so it's unclear that is an exclusive benefit. Our benefit is, however, exclusive, because you cannot escape the mold in the walls, because that is the place you live. So obviously you should care far more about our impact. The result of this is we've explained why housing gets way better for everyone. And I think if I find my sheets, this also beats opening closing opposition. Because they've got two claims. The first claim is that this is done in bad ways, and the government is going to force people to relocate to communal housing. First of all, this breaks the rules of the game, right? There's some level of magic in this debate. It is this house believes, not this house, not that we should. So I don't think this argument actually works. If the motion was, this house believes it takes a village to raise a child, and CEO were like, well, this means the government's going to take all the children and move them to villages, that would be an illegal argument, right? That's not actually how it works. And second of all, we beat this with our extension, because even if people are getting moved away, we've identified why their current living situation is so bad, you'd actually prefer they get moved away. That should also knock them out. The second claim is saying that this means people have to buy houses sooner, and that is bad. But for this to work, you've got to believe the first premise, which this housing is super bad. But we've explained that this housing is in fact not super bad, or at least not meaningfully worse than the alternative. So that extension nukes everyone in the debate. Let's go to extension 2. Actually, no, first opening.
Tragedy of the Commons explains why no one tenant complains because they expect someone else to. And when they do complain, the landlord can blame a different tenant, and you don't know if they did break the thing or not. So it's much harder to actually make the complaint successful.
No. So even if the landlord is like, this other tenant broke the heating, it's still their responsibility to fix it, so that blame game situation doesn't work. But the tragedy of the commons doesn't seem to work here, because it's incredibly acute if you don't have access to running water. So your problem would be like, oh, I'll just leave it, and then it's been a week and no one's announced anything. So obviously it's gonna be quite easy to get action on this. Second extension, why this increases the density of housing in desirable areas. Quite a simple extension. We explain when you share space for amenities, more people can live in an area. Opening government uses this mechanization to explain this means you get lower cost. But this is the worst impact of the debate, because you can get lower cost housing by moving to the middle of nowhere. You obviously care about the place that housing is. This means that we get construction of housing in desirable locations, such as cities, such as transport hubs, and such as other kinds of hubs. Both the opening and closing opposition are like, just build apartments, they go infinitely high. But like, they don't, right? You can't build an apartment infinitely high, which explains why you care about the footprint of this kind of place. So it explains why the increase in density is actually quite important. But second of all, it also extends this analysis to places where apartments aren't economical. So maybe you can build apartments in the CBD. You can't do it in other transport hubs because you don't have enough money to build a big apartment. So we explain why in other places people won't want to live its benefit. The impact here is pretty good because it means people can live places they want to live, they can do things they want to do, they can find jobs, and they can actually hang out with their friends, which is obviously quite a big impact to the debate. Closing government.
We could hypothetically have all 5 debates today inside this one room. We have like, maybe all of us would be like in this corner and there's another debate in that corner over there. But it wouldn't really work very well, right? Because you wouldn't be able to hear each other speaking. There'd be a lot of commotion and a lot of noise. And maybe Lachie is feuding with somebody in another room, and that's really awkward because he wants to give his speech over there, but somebody over there is that he really, really hates, and that making him feel nervous and awkward about himself. It just wouldn't be a situation we all be keen for. So whilst maybe it is space efficient in all of the debates inside one room, it's probably not something people would enjoy, but it's also not something that would be very helpful for their work environments or their mental health. So maybe it's something that we shouldn't do entirely. Let's explain that further. Firstly, on the extension, I think it's really sad that Lachie decides not to do in his whip speech any responses to closing opposition. Because I really like the 3 claims that we give you at Ellie, and I'm not quite sure why closing government has ignored them in this debate. Firstly, what do we tell you? That it's bad to live with people. I would note, opening opposition does not explain why even in the best case scenario, where you're living with people that you know, when you're living with people that aren't, murderers, it's still harmful. We give you 3 reasons why this is true. Firstly, it means you get close to the people that you live with at the expense of other individuals, and that's sad because you should have a diverse array of friends. Secondly, it encourages things like household fights. It means you cannot talk to other people rationally. That's a massive harm. Thirdly, you've got less effort to hang out with other people, but also the way that you engage with your roommates is that you're not actively spending time with them, but rather passively. Will says, but you're going to spend so much time together, everyone's going to get so close. That's not necessarily true, because just because you live with someone who has a shared kitchen doesn't mean you're incentivized to engage in productive conversation with them. But also, you're only seeing them outside of your work hours, and you're also probably encouraged to spend time away from home because you don't want to have to be in a shared kitchen the whole time. So that means you're probably not feeling particularly enthused about having conversation with individuals. You're probably feeling your worst because you've just finished a hard day at work. That means these conversations aren't the beautiful, optimistic ones that opening government claims. The second thing we tell you then is that this is done badly. We are the first team in this debate, I would note, to explain where this model actually takes place. The other teams imply, well, it's all rental housing. We give you a much more specific description, which that it is far more often are going to occur in low-income housing. And that's because these are the sorts of people that cannot make the choices about where they are living, but also they're the largest percentage of renters. So these are the people that then get unjustly put into living situations that they don't necessarily want to live with. This is particularly harmful because it increases the risk of large-scale problems happening, which is far more likely in a world in which you're living with low-income people who do not have access to steady jobs, who may be affected by a range of other personal and social issues. That means the environment they're living in is necessarily tumultuous. That is harmful. Closing government says, this isn't the motion though. Firstly, it is this house believes that, but it's also this house believes that we should. So it's still a we should motion, legends. But secondly, the claim from us is just that if this system were to happen, or if we believe the system should happen, this is the percentage of individuals that are affected by it, and this is what their circumstances look like. That is very much a part of this debate. You should not just dismiss that because it's not in the wording of the motion that you prescribe. Thirdly, we tell you though, is that people make bad decisions, and this is the highest impact claim in the debate. It means that people are less willing to move out of home, but it also means that people want to move into the property market because they don't want to have to opt into these commune-like living systems. As identified on opposition, there are people who are introverts and there are people for whom this is not their preference. Obviously, you ought not force them into this system, Closing government says, well, if you're an introvert, you should just hang in bed. That fucking sucks. What? You have to stay your whole time in your room? That's a shit life to live. If you're an introvert, you probably don't want to talk to someone the whole time. But then opening government tells you, oh, well, now you're going to rationalize all of your problems with other people. I would know. Oftentimes when people are going through something massive in their mental health, they are likely to take it out on the individuals around them. That is why you fight with your family so much. But also, people deal with that differently. Maybe for Will, they were happy to be able to talk to the people going to St. Joseph's College. But for a lot of people, your probs don't want to talk to your roommate you don't know very fucking well. How should you weigh these claims over opening opposition? Firstly, we're more charitable to OG's conception of the debate. We engage in the instances where you're moving in with people that you know and already like. Secondly, it deals with a more vulnerable set of actors and makes the risk characterised by opening opposition way more certain, because we're dealing with people who are low income, people who have a list of other social and cultural and political concerns ongoing in their life. That is why it is so much more challenging for them. Thirdly, the long-term harm of people making worse decisions by buying into the property market is an incredibly large-scale harm we can view on closing opposition. Literally to no response. I wish there was another whip after me so we could actually deal with it in this debate. Let's move on to CG. I'll take a point from CG though if you have one.
Point.
Yeah.
The living conditions of the people you care about with that extension, we proved to be really bad, and we help the living conditions of those people by giving them collective bargaining.
Oh yeah, fuck, let's talk about collective bargaining. But first density, because that's the order I have it written on the page. Density, you get people living in the city, you fix supply demand. Supply demand is symmetric, same thing, demand is the same. Secondly, why would this be in a city? City houses are the smallest. Unlikely you're going to get a commune living in this environment, probably far more likely to be outside the suburbs. Thirdly, not necessarily people want to live in a city, people want to live anywhere they want to. Fourthly, inflates the price, because now you're living in a central area. That's a harm they need to cop in the debate. Fifthly, Lachie says now you can do what you want. Probably can't do what you want if you're an introvert and you're stuck in your fucking bedroom. Secondly, on collectivization, they say you're forced to act better as a landlord because more people are living in the house. That's symmetric. Landlords are incentivized to work well under their metric because their literal only logic is you now want better tenants, you want better tenants on both sides of the house. Second claim, comparative power because you collectivize and work together. One, we tell you this happens in affordable housing, and even in the best case, renters are often people who have less money and are studying. It's unlikely they have access to the lawyers to be able to sue their tenant, even if there is more of them. Secondly, just because you are working together doesn't mean you work along rationally, you don't work amicably with one another. I think it's hard to assume that you're going to go to court as a collective of 10 people. Thirdly, it's possible for a landlord just to evict one couple inside like this large commune. So maybe you don't have an incentive to work with them because you yourself are really desperate to stay in this commune. So you don't want to work with your roommates to take your landlord to prison because you want to be able to stay living in your house. So it probably actually divides people up by who want to sue the landlord and who are really worried about their accommodation needs. Next claim, you now get cleaning and security, and Lachie says this is the highest impact in the debate. Panel, is it? Do people need cleaners? That seems crazy. Firstly, not to hate. The reason you probably need security is because you hate your fucking roommates and want to deal with them. Not that you need security from other people coming in, but maybe not some charitable. Secondly, to beat the benefits is massively costly. Thirdly, it's more expensive because there are more people living in the house. More cleaning services because there's more bedrooms. It takes longer. It's more expensive. That seems intuitive. Fourthly, not everyone wants to have a fucking cleaner. Like, maybe there is a person in the house who doesn't want to pay for cleaning services. Unclear way everybody would agree on this. I think that's a silly claim from closing government. Why is OG out of the debate? On efficiency, they say it's more cost efficiency. That's not true. Food is maybe cheaper, but it's also not because you have to get more food. So the food cost fucking evens out anyway. Space, jamming 6 people into this room in the same way and having 5 beds in one area is probably a bad thing. Their claims from OG out of the debate. Social benefits. I think a lot of these are silly. It's bad to burden other people with the responsibility of sharing your child. It's bad to burden them to do other things you don't want them to do. And it's silly to assume that all introverts want to live with other people. Obviously, CO win.